Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome all students and professors at one of the programs of Universal Science. This program is going to be in English because we have a special guest from London through an internet link. I would like to welcome Mr. Philip Blond, who became, as you could read it on our website, the chair of Christian philosophy and politics at our university. Mr. Blond is an internationally recognized political thinker and social and economic commentator. He is most known, perhaps, as the author of Red Tory, which sought to redefine the center ground of British politics around the ideas of civil association, mutual ownership, and shared enterprise. Through both his writings and speaking, he argues for a new economic and social politics based on free association and group formation, new forms of capitalism and market entry, as we can read on the website of Res Publica, a think tank that Mr. Blond founded. He is certainly an influential person because he is part of the inner circle of former Prime Minister David Cameron. Mr. Blond, very welcome to our studio through the internet. I hope we can welcome you very soon in person. And I'd like to start our conversation with asking you about the impact of the book. The question is whether this, sometimes called progressive conservatism, was it in filtering into everyday politics, how the impact is?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to point out that Red Tory was almost the first book in the West that argued that social liberalism and economic liberalism were the same thing. And so as normally the left advances social liberalism and the right advances economic liberalism. And they think they're opposed. But what I argued is that it's the same phenomenon, that both left and right in the overwhelming majority of Western polities are liberal and advance liberalism. So there's no difference between left and right. And they are both, in fact, two sides of the same liberal coin. And I said that this is what we now have to resist, that liberalism is the harbinger of insecurity, mass social and cultural insecurity, and that it only really serves the interests of the ruling elite, even though its ideological legitimation is that it serves everyone's interest. And if you look at one of the reasons for the rise of what's called populism across the West, it's essentially because of the renewal of almost class warfare, because the working classes and the poor have suffered terribly under the rule of liberal democracies. They've been left behind, they've been repudiated, they've been culturally humiliated. And so I think Red Tory was the first book in the Western West, if I can call it that, to essentially argue this point. There are, of course, antecedents, most famously Christopher Lasher's Revolt of the Elites back in the 90s, which is a prophetic text. But I think that's the claim to fame of Red Tory. Now, of course, every other book is about post-liberalism and the limits of liberalism. And I'm thrilled to see that's to be welcomed. But I think why Red Tory has continued to last is it was the first book in the contemporary era to make this claim. And I think the facts and the historical developments in anywhere from America to the United Kingdom to Europe to your own country have shown this largely to be true.
It seems to me that Christianity is a key element of your reasoning, and you are a Christian philosopher. And I'd like to ask you about what went wrong about Christianity, or what seems to have gone wrong about Christianity. If I may say, as a young person or a child in communist Hungary, our Christianity was a very important and cherished asset, in a way almost a political standing, and now we are kind of starting to go behind some sort of losing ground. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and to answer that question properly, one has to go back to the birth of the modern age, and where to begin. I think the most interesting claim to make is that the birth of the modern age is essentially on the idea that of autonomy, that we can be autonomous from the world, from other people, that we can find all of the sufficient grounds and cognitive foundations for the good life purely within our own efforts, and that God or the world or any external objective character was essentially fake. You know, the Feuerbachian thesis. It was a projection from our own self-imposed limits, that we should no longer limit ourselves. And it's really the birth of the liberal project. So what has destroyed Christianity is the liberal project that claimed philosophical foundations it could never meet, and claimed to deliver social goods that it's palpably failed to deliver. But this goes way back to the end of the Middle Ages, the birth of the early modern period. And if I was to answer it philosophically, it would be when we thought it was possible to produce truth separate from the transcendent, that we thought it was possible to have an immanent, if you forgive the language, form of truth. So that's the Kantian project. So if we can encapsulate Kant as the idea that contra Hume, so Hume said impressions occur in the mind, we don't know where they come from, and our reasoning is, as it were, built on sand. And Kant said, no, the mind can secure its own foundations. But by the end of his life, in Opus Posthum, Kant was saying that objects, that I see objects is really because objects come from me. So there's a complete loss of the objective order in the modern period. Now, that loss of the objective order begins with the denial of God. And where we are now, if you forgive me, fast forwarding, is that we're in a world where there seems to be no truth, no beauty, no goodness, because everything is reduced to subjective assertion. So we've subjectivized the world to such an extent that that words like truth have no purchase. So that what now happens philosophically is everything is back to almost a pagan world. And if you look at the gods of the pagan world, the pagan pantheon, everything is about power. So the gods are essentially like us, but more powerful versions. You know, Zeus comes down and rapes people, and human beings are indeed the playthings of these deities. And what the Judeo-Christian God introduced was the idea that there was, first in Judaism, the idea that there's law, and then in Christianity that there is love. And that means that the absolute has a stake in us. That's the Christian revolution and the Jewish revolution, that God has a stake in us and our flourishing. And this is something that Greek conceptuality could never explain. Why would the absolute care about us? And Plato got closest to it, where he talked about the absolute as the good. And I think that what we've seen with the collapse of the modern project into essentially power, and that's all that modernity culminates in, is conflict of power, which is Marx the Great horrific battles of the 20th century, is that actually human beings need to live by something other than power, that human beings need to re-establish connection with the objective order, with the world, with moral reality, and yes, with God, because it's only the recognition that all of these objective goods are both given to us, but also transcendent, i.e. they're not wholly exhausted by us or eclipsed by us, that anything like the good life might be possible again. Sorry, that was a long philosophical explanation, which I apologize for. The short answer is that Christianity became liberal and became modern, and now God is whatever you want God to be.
We are hoping that you will come here and give us many more longer philosophical explanations beyond this short interviews time frame. But what you were telling us, I came up with the question, how can you be personally free, feeling free, and at the same time becoming a good and active member of a community? Because it seems to me that the liberal or kind of far liberal thinking only concentrates on the individual, but the society is built up of several different groups of people, communities. So how can we consolidate the two thoughts, personal freedom and being good community persons?
Well, I think you've put your finger, you've answered your own question rather well. The only aim of modernity is to secure autonomy, which in practice means the only aim of modernity is to secure autonomy for those who are most able to enjoy it. That's why the modern period enfranchises the already powerful and the already well-positioned. So the modern period is the defense of unaccountable elites, because it's, if you're autonomous, you feel you don't owe anything to anybody. Whereas the earlier notion of a king or Christian kingship, for instance, was that Aquinas even thought a king could be removed if they failed to uphold Christian principles. So the real nature of human beings is we're never alone. We are never autonomous. We're born into a family if we're lucky, and that family has duties of responsibility to us. We also have a duty to the world, to nature, to creation, and to other human beings. So we're born into networks of solidarity and mutual affection. We begin first, of course, with those who are closest to us, but we reason by analogy from love of those who are close to us to essentially love of all human kind, and indeed love of all creation. And so what is equally synonymous with the Rousseauian Marxist liberal approach is avarice and all manner of human carnage. If your only values are the realization of your own will or your own desires, well, that can be anything extreme. You might wish to eat other human beings. You might wish to rape and murder other human beings. After all, this is what people do. And even if people agree, they can do equally repulsive things. I always used to use in my lectures to my students, when they thought if two people consented, how could evil result? There was a case, I think in England, of somebody who wanted to be eaten and somebody who wanted to eat them. And they agreed, and this guy murdered this guy and ate him, but said it was fine because that's what he wanted to happen. So the point is that unless we are tied into networks of greater obligation, duty, love, affection, what we owe to the world, what the world owes to us, we just become an ever more degraded, narcissistic project. And in the end, you can be imprisoned by your own freedom rather than freed from it. And the only type of freedom that elevates you is the type of freedom that makes a demand upon you, to use language, creates an ought, that you ought to fulfill in order to be who you are. And that, I think, is truer to human nature, that human nature needs educating in the virtues and educating in terms of advancement, such that it can become itself. Without that, you'll just have the freedom of a degraded person, really.
In Hungary, many people really follow with a little bit of sadness the story of Brexit. We certainly understand that the British decided to leave the European Union, but we are very unhappy about it. And the bilateral relations will be kind of redefined and strengthened after the Brexit. But based on your philosophical thinking, what do you think will be the impact on the British society of Brexit?
Well, I think one way to answer that is, why did Brexit happen? Brexit happened for the reasons I said in my opening remarks, that the British people and the British working class, though it wasn't just them, it was much more varied, felt that they were being governed by distant cosmopolitan order that was imposing upon them false sets of values, quite extreme claims around minorities, and subjecting majorities to the rule of minorities is, I think, a good way of putting it. And I think they identify Brexit with rule with by alien powers, to paraphrase Marx, that they were being governed by people who had no affection or care for them. And the British are also, a bit like the Hungarians, intensely patriotic, deeply proud of their history, rightly, in my view, and felt that really, since Mrs. Thatcher, Britain has been governed by extreme liberalism of left and right. And that has abandoned huge swathes of the country to indifference. And it was, in my view, Brexit was an attempt to recover solidarity. Solidarity between the British, so that the British would look after each other. Now, in my view, I'm a great fan of Western civilization and of European civilization. I was never a supporter of Brexit. And I wasn't a supporter of Brexit because I supported sort of Macron or kind of European liberals. I wanted us to remain, basically because I think we're part of a wider civilizational project, which is the Judeo-Christian European project. And I think that Britain has many times defended that project and sacrificed blood in large number, and we often fight when we don't need to, and the British fight out of principle when they don't need to fight. And
it's very similar in the Hungarian scene as well.
Yeah. This is why why I have enjoyed meeting the Hungarians so much.
I wanted to ask you about your Hungarian interest as a final question. I know that Steve Hilton, one of Mr. Cameron's advisors, is of Hungarian origin. David Campanale, who I also know, was one of the founders of Tusványos. So who gave you the idea to start linking up with the Hungarians?
It was David, who's a friend, David Campanale, who's a friend anyway. And I was also interested in Hungary because I'm interested in what the Hungarians and the Poles have achieved. You know, there's much hysteria about them, but they've achieved more for the working class and poor in their communities than anyone else in Europe has. And your family policy, advanced by Katalin Novak, is, I think, really one of the first forms of social policy that it aims to stabilize human beings. So I had a policy interest, and then David introduced me, and I went over, and I met Scholt Nemeth, who was marvelous, wonderful, and all sorts of people. And just, I love meeting different cultures, and the folk dancing and the wine was extremely persuasive. And I enjoyed it tremendously, and just meeting groups of intellectuals and getting to understand, you know, a deeply intellectual Central European culture. Well, that's why I was so attracted to the position and to learning more.
I hope that we can welcome you in person, as I already mentioned it at the beginning, very soon in Budapest. I'd like to wish you all the best without COVID. And I'd like to urge our colleagues and students, when Mr. Blond is here, make the chance to meet him. Thank you very much.
My great pleasure. Thank you.